ways. So let's start with the most obvious and talk about the skin. This is obviously the most obvious place to apply topicals. We're usually using herbs in this manner for open wounds, cuts, scrapes, splinters, lacerations, puncture wounds, right? Anytime the tissue is opened and you're bleeding, right? Oftentimes we're using herbs topically for venomous stings, bites, contact with irritants, poisons, like irritating plants. You get the nettle sting, or you get some poison oak or poison ivy, things like that. Trauma injuries, so broken bones, sprains, strains, contusions, muscle injuries, pain, right? We use herbs topically quite a bit for pain. That can be oftentimes muscle pain more often than not, but they can be used for deeper joint pain, headache pain. So these are not uncommon ways that we use herbs directly on the skin. Now, the primary actions that are the most relevant here, one is vulnerary for sure. So vulnerary means something that is going to be wound healing. Wound healing herbs oftentimes are astringent in nature. What we find, what's very common with a vulnerary herb, which means it will heal a wound, as we see oftentimes many common sub-actions there associated with that. So astringency being one, whereby the herb will tighten, bind, and contract the tissues. This is usually through the presence of tannins that will... Tannins are cool. They kind of knit proteins together in a way, is the way that we understand them. They knit proteins together, tighten and bind them. So that's what helps to bind a wound back together over time. Oftentimes they're inflammation modulating. Oftentimes they're styptics. So styptics will help stop bleeding. We've got some really great remedies that are super important first aid herbs for that. So the styptics will staunch bleeding. You also have, your basic antimicrobial type properties, antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral. Okay, so again, I'm not a huge fan of these terms all the time, but they are useful. So I think it's good to just use them with specificity. So you've got things like, viral herpes lesions, like cold sores. You've got bacterial infections that can occur on the skin. You've got fungal infections, tinea pedis, athlete's foot, jock itch, things like that, fungal infections. So those types of antimicrobial actions can be very useful to consider for use on the skin. Demulcents can be really good for dry skin conditions. In inflamed skin conditions to kind of cool and soothe inflammation on the skin. And then you have your rubefactants, which would be essentially circulatory stimulants, very localized circulatory stimulants to drive blood to a local area. Rubefactia, another term you'll see for that is counter-irritant, which is... it's the same property, but it's basically flooding blood, dilating the capillary beds, kind of irritates the skin a little bit. Usually a counter irritant will produce a bit of redness. Like the nettle rash, the nettle sting is counter irritation, right? If you put a bunch of cayenne pepper or mustard on the skin, you got to be really careful with mustard because it can raise blisters, but especially like mustard powder. Specifically there, but that's counter irritation or the rubefacient property. So these are the main actions that I tend to think of herbs, the actions of herbs that you would consider applying topically onto the skin. Now we have some specific preparations here that I think is very good to get a hang of making these, right? So the first would be poultices. So a poultice basically is oftentimes the fresh herb, but you can do this with powders too, where you mix. If it's fresh herb, oftentimes you can just crush it. Sometimes mixed with a little bit of flour. and sometimes a little water to make it a little more liquidy if need be. Sometimes, like if you're out in the field, you'll just pop it in your mouth, chew it up, and then slap it on that way. But it's basically just applying crushed, mushy plant material. Of course, classic one here is like the spit poultice of plantain for bee stings, splinters, all manner of first aid situations, cuts, scrapes, wounds, things like that. Very, very good. I've heard of, plantain's really awesome here. I've even heard of it preventing anaphylactic reactions in people from like bee stings. Especially if you're doing a spit poultice, right? The benefit of the spit poultice is not only, you're getting your poultice applied, but you're generally also swallowing the juice of the plant, swallowing some of the plant, so you get some internal action there too. But the poultice, very, very good. Comfrey poultices, classically used for broken bones. I think there's whole ways that there's an art to creating really effective poultices, especially for pain, injury, muscles, broken bones, etc. There's a whole artistry to compounding, blending, and preparing really good, effective poultices. You also have fomentations or washes. So typically a wash obviously is just making an infusion or decoction of the herbal water extract of the herb and washing an afflicted area. That's typically used for infectious type situations. A fomentation, from my understanding, is basically a wash that where you're soaking cloth in that tea and wrapping or applying that medicated cloth to that local area. Then, of course, you've got your infused oils, which are a very common way herbs are applied topically, whereby you take the herb and you extract it in some sort of, fixed oil, whether that be olive oil, avocado oil, castor oil, whatever it might be. Those infused oils are really great used as is. They oftentimes are made as bases for preparing creams or for preparing salves. The nice thing about a salve is basically an infused oil with beeswax melted into it to solidify it slightly. You don't want it too solid because then it's just messy to apply. You like getting your salve consistency down is, I think, key to a good quality salve. But the nice thing about a salve is just the ease of application. I think salves are one of the most convenient ways of delivering and applying herbs topically. One thing I will mention though about salves, side note here, is you have to be a bit careful in using salves on infectious skin situations, especially like bacterial infections like MRSA, because oftentimes those types of bacterial infections they thrive in an anaerobic environment. Well, what happens with salves is that the beeswax in the salve, if you put it on, put enough of it on, it's going to tend to create an anaerobic environment. So you have to be a bit careful actually with using salves for infectious skin situations. I would say specifically, really resistant type bacterial skin diseases, even maybe some fungal things. You just want to be careful that you don't create an anaerobic environment, because sometimes those skin infections can actually spread to how far you put the salve on, right? I heard Paul Bergner telling stories of that with cases of MRSA that would spread right to the border of where the salve was put on. So that's something to be aware of with salves. And then you have liniments. Now, a liniment is a much more of a liquid that's most conveniently is sprayed on. So you spray a liniment on. These are usually alcohol preparations. Now that can be alcohol like from a tincture. You can use tinctures as basically if you put a tincture topically on the skin, it's a liniment. But some liniments are strictly for topical usage. And because of that, some of them are actually prepared with isopropyl alcohol. Obviously, you can't take that internally. What's common is that liniments are commonly used more for musculoskeletal issues, on sore muscles, injuries, stiff joints. It's very common, in Eastern medicine. There's the Dittajaus, which are martial arts liniments. Different martial arts schools usually have their unique recipe of a Dittajau, which are, liniments used for bruises, broken bones, sprains, strains, right? Martial artists commonly get hurt. I grew up doing martial arts starting from the age of 4 up till 18. So I did martial arts for a really long time, traditional Japanese martial art. And we had our specific recipe of Dittajau that was unique to the dojo that I trained in. That was really worked very, very well. It was very, very aromatic. Definitely had some toxic plants in there. It was not for internal use. I remember there being some aconite in there and lots of other things. So anyways, some of the classic herbs here topically for the skin, probably not news to any of you that have been studying herbalism for a while, or even some of you that are maybe still new to herbalism. These are really common herbs, great herbs to start with, great herbs to get to know, great herbs to have around your house, your car, your first aid kit, take them hiking and backpacking, and when you're traveling, things like plantain, calendula, comfrey. These are I would say these are probably our 3 primary classic wound healing herbs for topical usage. The one thing I would note about comfrey for if using it for wounds is to not use comfrey on puncture wounds. It works so well at healing wounds. In a way, I always think of comfrey kind of heals top down, meaning it can heal the surface of the skin, but not the deeper puncture, and it can trap debris. It can prevent the wound from, being properly cleaned, right? And it can just create an environment more prone to infection. So be a little careful with comfrey for puncture wounds. Otherwise, any type of other wound that's not too deep is good. Yarrow is really great here. That's kind of a primary styptic that I prefer to use. I also like it in wound healing, salves, infused oils, things like that. Yarrow's great. Cayenne is very, very nice for stiff sore muscles. Really love cayenne. I use it a lot. As someone that deals with chronic pain, I use a pretty good amount of topicals, and I think cayenne's one of the best for topical pain. Echinacea, key herb. Not a lot of people remember that echinacea is very good topically. Anytime there is some sort of topical infection, echinacea is very, very good. It's also really key for any type of bites, poisonous bites, venomous bites. Talking, copperhead, rattlesnake, brown recluse, black widow, those types of things. Echinacea topically and internally, really, really good. I also like arnica here for pain. Arnica salve is pretty classic there for injury, pain, inflammation, etc. Also, it's also worth mentioning, crystalline menthol, or even just or peppermint essential oil, very good. Topical anodyne, menthol, also camphor, very, very good there. So these are some of our pretty classic topical applications for the skin.